sail for New York, never to return. During the course of the next 30 minutes, we'll tell you the real story of the Titanic, with the only film footage ever shot of the great liner, and also the only film footage of the aftermath of the tragedy. Film which was only recently discovered in a garden shed in Northamptonshire. Well, we're going now to the Midlands to find out how this important film of the Titanic was discovered after all these years.
We were talking about old films, that was his life. I said, "Have you got that Titanic film?" She said, "Uh-huh. Might come in handy someday."
Renee Mason found the lost film of the Titanic in her garden shed. Renee's husband, Archie, started as a trainee projectionist in 1913.
Oh, he started when he was 13. And but he's shown films all his life until he was over 80. And that's how I met him, because I worked, he showed films at one cinema, and I played the violin for the silent pictures in the other. That's how we met. His cinema's in one street and my cinema's in with another, and that's how we met. And I heard about the film they're making in America, Titanic. Oh, wonder where that whole film is. So I said to my son David, have a look in the shed. I said Dad kept all his old stuff in the shed. You know, he searched and searched, no, he said he must have got rid of it. Well, I didn't think he would. He liked it too much. And I thought myself, I could have another look. I couldn't find it. That was on a Saturday. I went to bed, woke up in the night, well, half asleep and half awake, and I heard this voice say, "It's in the shed. It's in the shed under the bench." Oh, I thought to myself, that's funny. I woke up, I got up ever so early in the morning, Sunday morning.
So big were they that the yard at Belfast had to firstly build new slipways before their construction could begin. The huge gantry dominated the skyline of the city. At over 850 feet in length, new quays had to be built in Southampton to accommodate the liners. In New York, the authorities were a little slow in preparing themselves for this new breed of passenger ship. These important scenes show the Titanic's sister gradually rising towards the sky, with the huge hull plates being lifted in for the riveters to begin their deafening work. In less than 4 months, a second keel would be laid down, that of a ship destined for disaster. This rare archive film has survived remarkably intact, its rusty tin helping to preserve the nitrate material. By the autumn of 1910, work on the liner's hull was complete, and she was launched into the water amidst great celebration. Work would now proceed to finish the liner off, ready for her maiden voyage in the summer of 1911. Titanic would get none of this attention at its launch a few months later. If the cameraman had panned just slightly to the left, he would have glimpsed the Titanic in the throes of construction. With the foresight of cameramen from the early part of the 20th century, we've been able to get a glimpse through a window on the past at the legend of Titanic. One thing is for certain, this legend will continue well into the 21st century.
We were doing 25 knots from the time we left Queenstown, and the morning of the 14th we knew there was ice. There was ice all over the place, but nobody seemed to. I suppose they did care a bit, but I don't know. We had the designer on board, Andrews, and we had Bruce Ismay, the chairman, who lost his job over it because I think it was through him being on board that we were out to break that record. Then things began to happen, and she was taken in water, and she was gradually listing over to port. Then I thought, well, I don't know, this is something very serious now. And then we had orders to get the boats out, and all the lifeboats were swung out. And I might tell you that the distance from the lifeboats to the water was 70-odd feet. And then we had orders to women and children into the lifeboats. She gradually sank by the head, and you could feel everything going through her. A rumble of everything movable was going down. And she gradually, she went down, then she came up, and she was almost vertical out of the water. And I climbed, there were two boards aft, which said, keep clear of propeller blades. And I was hanging on to this, waiting to drop in. You couldn't see the water, we were too far away from it. I had a lifebelt on. I let go, and as I passed, I saw the two propeller blades.
Oddly enough, the Titanic sailed past his home along the banks of Southampton water. The grim task of collecting bodies from the sea was given to the cable ship Mackay Bennett. She left Halifax on April the 17th for the 4-day passage to the scene. The makeshift coffins are stored on the deck. Captain Lardner and his crew picked up 306 bodies, a third of which were buried at sea. Nothing remained of the ship Titanic. It would be 72 years before she was seen again. And I'm joined on this quayside in Southampton by Milvina Dean, one of only 2 English survivors of the Titanic who are still alive. Milvina, how did you come to be a passenger on the Titanic?
Well, we were emigrating to Kansas. My father had a public house in London and was told by his relations in Kansas there was more opportunity there, so he decided to emigrate to Kansas. And we weren't supposed to go on the Titanic, we were going on another ship. But because there was a coal strike at the time, and all the coal was needed for the maiden voyage of the Titanic, they asked him if he'd like to go on the Titanic. So of course he was delighted.
In the years which followed, did your mother recount details of the tragedy to you?
The little my mother spoke about it, she never said it was awfully bad or anything. And she sent a card home to my grandmother in the forest saying everything is fine up to now. She sent that from Ireland, from Queenstown, and everything is fine up to now. It sounded really a bit ominous, didn't it?
Did she, in the years which followed, did she recount to you what had happened on the Titanic?
Not until I was 8 years old. And then she was going to get married again, so thought that she'd better tell me about it. So all she said was, the night it happened, we were all in the cabin, and my mother and father, they heard a crash. And my father said he'd go up on deck to see what had happened. He went up on deck and said apparently the ship had struck an iceberg. Get the children out of bed and up on deck as quickly as possible. That's what my mother did. They never stopped to think the ship is unsinkable, as some did. And we got up on deck, I think with the help of a sailor. And my mother was saying goodbye to my father, and he said, hope to see you later. And got into lifeboat number 13. Because I was small, I was put in a sack over and put over the side. And my mother didn't realise that my small brother was there as well. She didn't realise that he wasn't with us until they were rescued by the Carpathia. When I think back, as a child, I can't remember my aunt, uncle, or anybody saying anything about it. I just knew I was brought up thinking my grandfather was my father because he made so much fuss of me. And of course, I didn't know my father. So, well, things went on, I imagine, pretty normally. I mean, I remember my mother having the most dreadful headaches.
The effect on Southampton was devastating. More than 500 people, mostly crew, would not return. Whole streets in some quarters lost a male member of the household, creating social problems for many years. Did your family get compensation from the White Star Line?
Well, yes, they paid for our schooling, and my mother had a pension. But whether that pension still went on when she remarried, I don't know.
You've never seen this much acclaimed film?
Titanic?
Yes.
No.
Tell me why.
Well, because first half would be okay, but the second half, no. When the ship is going down and the people are panicking, jumping overboard, I wonder what my father would be doing. Although I didn't know him, I still think about him.
You've been a celebrity now for a great many years, but would you say that this film, the release of the film, The Titanic, has increased your celebrity status as a Titanic survivor?
After the film came out, oh, it became hectic. It became much too much. My phone was ringing all day long. People wanted to go here, there and everywhere and have interviews, come to see me. Oh, yes, it was awful the first couple of months, say, because I didn't have any peace at all. I got quite tired of it all because it was too much.
Storekeeper Frank Prentice was plucked from the freezing sea by lifeboat number 4 after it returned to the scene.
Oh, she was a fine ship. 46,000 tons, 4 funnels. One was a dummy, but they had 4. They were buff colour with black boot topping. She was about 900 feet overall, 90 feet at midships. We had 16 lifeboats, 8 on port, 8 on starboard side. The lifeboats were fully loaded, would carry 50 passengers. And when you come to think that we had 2,300 on board, the lifeboats didn't carry too many. They could carry, if they'd been fully loaded, 800. The whole tragedy of the sinking of the Titanic was speed. That was better. The only thing they thought about was
Note the telegram boy, desperate to get his face known to the camera. He bought a telegram for one of the survivors. The crew of the Carpathia would have thrilling stories to tell for many years to come. These are the berths at the Cunard docks, where just the night before, 30,000 had gathered to get a glimpse of the survivors disembarking from Carpathia. Just along from here at Pier 59, a space had been booked for noon on Saturday the 20th of April for the maiden departure from New York of the Titanic. Many of the survivors left from these quaysides for their return to Europe, with their plans to live in the new world at an end. As New York mourned, its citizens brought spare clothing to the docks, indeed anything to comfort those men, women and children who'd lost everything. These scenes portray an Edwardian New York, with the women wearing the dress of the period. At the time these films were taken, cinematography was just 15 years old. The Titanic saga was the first incident of its kind to receive attention from the new moving image cameras. There were many heroes in this disaster, but none more than Captain Rostron and his crew of the Carpathia. He was knighted soon afterwards and died in 1940 at his hometown of Southampton. Father Hogue is reported as being one of the first people to spot the Titanic's lifeboats as the Carpathia neared the scene. He quite probably held services on board the rescue ship for those who perished. These are sequences of the actual crew rescued from the sea. Their faces tell the story they had lived through just 72 hours before. Many of the crew would testify at the inquiries held in New York and London to determine the cause of the tragedy. The inquiry in New York began the day after the survivors arrived in the city. This is Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who was actually at the wheel of the Titanic as it hit the iceberg. He was to turn his wheel quickly to starboard by order of the first officer. These are more than likely the crew of the Carpathia, illustrating to reporters how Titanic's crew and passengers adorned the important life preserver belt. Here is Italian-born Marconi after giving evidence to the Senate investigation. It was his wireless radio invention that helped to save so many lives that calm, cold night on the North Atlantic. He and his wife very nearly sailed on the maiden voyage.
The transatlantic Titanic was the largest ship of its time, but its life was very short. The first and only voyage of the ship began April 10, 1912, and ended 4 days later. This tragedy occurred on the night of April 14th through the 15th, 1912. When the Titanic crashed, at least 1,496 people died, making this disaster one of the largest shipwrecks in history. Among the passengers of the ship were some of the richest people in the world, as well as immigrants from Ireland, Great Britain, and Scandinavia, who were heading to the United States and people on board. Here is an interesting fact about the construction of the ship. 5 people were required to drive only one rivet. It was hellish work. One person heated the rivet in the furnace until it was hot. Then the heated rivet was placed in the hole, where 2 people held the rivet on one side, while on the other side, 2 people started beating it with heavy hammers. From the blows, the rivet expanded and held the sheets together. It took these guys 4 minutes to complete the work with one rivet. But in 1912, the workers had to meet this demand within 20 seconds. The deadlines were tight, and only strong guys were able to do such work. After all, there were 3 million rivets on the Titanic. The ship began its journey from Southampton, England, then proceeded to France and Ireland, and from there went to America. But the journey was soon interrupted when the Titanic crashed into an iceberg. The collision caused damage to the ship, and the ship began to sink. After 2.5 hours, it was completely underwater. The collapse of the Titanic agitated the whole world, not only because of the large number of victims, but also because of the mistakes made during the catastrophe. Public research was conducted in the United States and England, and a list of changes in ship safety standards was provided. The wreckage of the Titanic was lost for a long time at the bottom of the ocean, but they were discovered on September 1st, 1985 at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean at a depth of 12,415 feet. Thanks to this, it was possible to extract many valuable things from the seabed. These exhibits are stored in various world museums. The Titanic is possibly the most famous ship in history. The memory still lives on, thanks to numerous films, books, songs, and exhibitions dedicated to this liner. But although everyone knows the history of Titanic, there are secrets that almost no one has heard. The first departure of this ship for navigation was under threat. In England, the miners began a strike, demanding higher wages. How was this related to the Titanic? It simply did not have enough coal for the furnaces, because coal had stopped being mined. The tickets cost a lot of money, and almost all had already been sold out. People handed over tickets purchased on other ships to buy the coveted piece of paper, which cost many lives. And for the cheapest ticket, you had to give only £2 of sterling. This is about $86 in modern money. It is worth noting that most of the tickets that were sold were for £2 of sterling for the third class. These tickets made up the main profit for the Titanic because almost every worker could afford such a ticket. The most expensive ticket for the Titanic was worth about $30,000 of today's money. The management understood that in no case should the voyage be canceled so that people would not demand their money back, because part of the money from the sold tickets was used to buy all the coal that remained in the mines throughout the country and on all of the ships that canceled their trips due to the shortage of passengers from the competition of the Titanic. As a result, the liner safely began to take on passengers. The last surviving passenger of the Titanic died in 2009 at 97 years old. Her name was Melvina Dean, and she was 2.5 months old when the ship sank. She was the youngest passenger of the Titanic. The girl traveled with her parents and brother. Her family sold all her property in England and wanted to open a tobacco shop in the United States. But her father died in the shipwreck, and the surviving family members were forced to return to England. Disgraced Japanese. Masabumi Hosono was the only Japanese aboard the Titanic. He worked as a government official in the Japanese Ministry of Transport. When the ship began to sink, the man managed to get onto one of the few rescue boats that were intended primarily for children and women. When this story became known, he was awaited by shame in his native country. He lost his job and was condemned by all his countrymen. This shame was so serious that when the Titanic film was released, the Masabumi family published a letter in the press apologizing for the act of their relative, although the man himself was no longer alive. But there were also heroes on the Titanic. On board the Titanic was only one Mexican, Deputy Manuel Uruchurtu, who traveled to Paris. At the time of the shipwreck, the Mexican politician gave up his place to a woman who told him that in New York, she was waiting for her husband and son. The only thing that Manuel asked in return was that the woman visit his wife and tell her about his last minutes. He died that terrible night, and the surviving passenger visited his widow in 1924, 12 years after the tragedy. She would later admit that in fact that at the time of the shipwreck, she did not have children or a husband. The downfall of the Titanic was predicted. 14 years before the Titanic tragedy, Morgan Robertson wrote a novel entitled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. This book tells about the largest ship of that time, which collided with an iceberg in the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean on a cold April night. This ship in this story was called Titan and was very similar to Titanic, even in the picture. Therefore, many ask the question, was it a coincidence or a prediction of the future? In our lifetime, A group of researchers for over 30 years has carefully studied the materials about the loss of the Titanic, and at the end of 2016, they made a sensational statement. It turned out that the cause of the disaster was not only an iceberg. In fact, the catastrophe was indeed predetermined in many respects in advance. The fact is that before the ship entered the voyage, an event occurred that later played an important role during the crash. A few days before the Titanic's fateful departure, a fire broke out in one of its fuel depots. The captain of the ship was well aware of this problem, but he decided to handle it on his own. After all, the prestige of the most luxurious, huge, and beautiful ship of its time was at stake. The crew fought the fire on their own for several days, and when the Titanic arrived at the port, it was moved to the shore on the other side, so the passengers could not see the soot and charred paint. Traces of soot were clearly visible in many photographs, but until that moment, no one had paid attention to the fire that had happened. The ship was on the move and seemed completely serviceable and invincible. Because of the flames, the temperature inside the compartment reached 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The metal of the ship lost its elasticity and became brittle. Under normal conditions, a collision with an iceberg would not have caused such fatal damage, but unfortunately, the blow happened at just the most weakened place. The Titanic cannot get out of the ocean. Have you ever wondered why the Titanic has still not gotten out of the water? It could be turned into a museum or an attraction and get a lot of money. But the wreckage of the ship cannot be lifted from the bottom, as they are badly damaged and will break apart during any movement. In addition, the process of destruction continues. Surprisingly, when the ship was discovered in 1985, it was in fairly good condition due to the high pressure at the depth and a lack of light. Where the Titanic was located, there was a lot of living creatures that slowed down the corrosion process. However, everything changed a few years ago when a bacteria appeared to begin to destroy the metal. It is surprising that no one has ever discovered this bacterium. Yes, a previously unknown bacteria is eating away at Titanic and turning it into waste, which the ocean will soon swallow. This is why the Titanic cannot be recovered. Now that you know these stories, write in the comments what you think about it, and don't forget to put like if you like this video. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more.